A girl is not a debt you can hand across a border. Grace Miller heard the sentence only in her mind, quiet and trembling, as the war bell rang over Silverbrook long before sunrise. The sound rolled through the frozen valley, low and hollow, shaking frost from the pine branches and pulling frightened faces to dark windows. At 19, Grace knew what that bell meant. It meant an emergency council. It meant someone powerful had failed, and someone powerless would pay for it. She stood barefoot in the upstairs hallway of the pack house, one hand pressed to the wall, listening through the narrow gap beneath the council room door. Firelight flickered over the floorboards. Men spoke in low voices. Paper scraped against wood. Then Alpha Warren said her name. Not as if she were a daughter of Silverbrook. Not as if she had carried water to their sick, mended winter coats for their children, and spent every harvest season working until her fingers ached. He said it the way a banker might say livestock, timber, or land. Grace Miller will settle the Blackridge claim. The room went silent for half a breath. Then Elder Boone exhaled in relief. She is unmated. No formal bond. No inheritance worth contesting. Grace felt the cold climb through her chest. Her fingers tightened around the sleeve of her nightgown, but she did not move. If she moved, the old floor would creak. If the floor creaked, they would know she had heard. Blackridge asked for silver, another elder said. We have none. They asked for grain. The barns are empty. Then they asked for blood compensation, Alpha Warren replied, and the words slid beneath the door like smoke. They will accept the girl instead. The girl. Grace closed her eyes. Not Grace. Not the child her mother had once held beside the healer's hearth. Not the quiet Omega who never complained when given the worst chores, the smallest meals, the coldest room at the back of the house. Just the girl. A line on a treaty. A price written in ink. From below, the village stirred in panic. Dogs barked. Mothers called children inside. Somewhere a baby cried, thin and sharp in the bitter morning air. Grace thought of them, of the little ones who had nothing to do with unpaid boarders or proud alphas or old rivalries. If Silverbrook refused Blackridge, there would be no peace. If there was no peace, those children would be the first to suffer. Her throat tightened. She hated that the thought came so quickly. She hated that even now, even while they sold her, some part of her still wanted to protect them. A chair scraped inside the council room. Does she need to agree? Someone asked. Alpha Warren gave a soft, humorless laugh. She is Omega. She will do what keeps this pack alive. Grace stepped back from the door as if the words had touched her skin. Down the hall, her stepsister Madison appeared in a robe of pale blue, her blonde hair loose over her shoulders, her eyes already bright with curiosity. So it's true, Madison whispered, and her mouth curved just enough to hurt. They finally found a use for you. Grace looked at her, searching for even a flicker of pity. There was none. Only relief. Only distance. As if Grace were already gone. Madison's gaze drifted to the small silver locket at Grace's throat, the last thing her mother had left her. You should pack light, she said. Blackridge won't care what you bring. For a moment, Grace imagined saying everything she had swallowed for years. That kindness was not weakness. That silence was not consent. That being unwanted did not make a person worthless. But the words stayed behind her teeth, hot and heavy. She turned away instead, walking back to her room with her spine straight and her heart quietly breaking. Her room was barely 10 feet wide, with a narrow bed, a cracked mirror, and one window overlooking the snow-covered training yard. On the sill sat bundles of dried lavender and feverfew, herbs she had kept from her mother's old garden. Grace touched them gently. Her mother used to say healing did not always look powerful. Sometimes it looked like warm hands, steady breath, and choosing not to become cruel when the world had every chance to teach you how. Grace pulled a small canvas bag from beneath the bed and folded one dress, one sweater, and the gray scarf her mother had knitted before the fever took her. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and listened as footsteps gathered outside her door. They were coming to collect their payment. She pressed the scarf to her chest and whispered into the dark, "If I must be the price of peace, then I will not let them see me break." Outside, the first pale line of dawn touched the valley. Silverbrook waited for her to disappear. Blackridge waited to receive her. And somewhere beyond both borders, beneath a sky still heavy with stars, the Alpha King had not yet spoken. The knock came only once, not as a question, but as a warning that her life no longer belonged to the quiet room where she had learned to survive. Grace opened the door before they could enter, her canvas bag in one hand, her mother's gray scarf wrapped carefully around her shoulders. 2 Silverbrook guards stood in the hallway, both men she had known since childhood. One had once carried her across a flooded creek when she was 7. The other had brought his feverish daughter to Grace after midnight and wept with gratitude when the child finally slept. Neither of them looked her in the eye now. Behind them, Alpha Warren waited in a dark coat trimmed with wolf fur, his face composed, his hands folded over the treaty tube as if it were something sacred instead of something shameful. "You are ready," he said. It was not a question. Grace looked past him toward the stairs, where pack members had gathered in silence. Women in wool robes, men with guarded faces, children peeking from behind their parents. No one spoke her name. No one stepped forward. In their eyes, she saw the terrible relief of people watching another person walk toward the storm so it would not reach their own door. "Will it save them?" Grace asked quietly. Alpha Warren's expression tightened. "Your cooperation will preserve the peace." That was not the same as yes, and they both knew it. Madison stood near the banister, wrapped in a cream-colored shawl, looking almost disappointed that Grace was not crying. "Try not to embarrass us," she murmured. Grace turned her head just enough to meet her stepsister's gaze. "I hope you never learn what it costs to be useful to cruel people." Madison's smile faded. For one small second, the hallway became still enough to hear the wind press against the windows. Then Alpha Warren cleared his throat. "The carriage is waiting." Outside, Silverbrook looked softer than it had any right to look. Snow lay over the rooftops like powdered sugar. Smoke curled from chimneys. The training yard, where stronger wolves had laughed at Grace for moving too gently, was washed in pale gold dawn. At the bottom of the steps, an old black carriage waited between 4 riders from Blackridge Pack. Their cloaks were charcoal gray, their faces unreadable beneath winter hoods. The horses stamped at the frozen ground, breath rising in white clouds. Grace descended slowly. Every board of the front steps remembered her. Every corner of the village seemed to hold some small piece of her life. The well where she had carried water, the bakery window where Mrs. Halpern used to slip her day-old rolls, the healer's shed where her mother had once smelled of rosemary and warm candle wax. She wanted to memorize it and forget it all at once. Just before she reached the carriage, a small figure darted from behind the woodpile. "Grace." It was Noah, the baker's youngest boy, no more than 8 years old, with a red scarf nearly covering his chin. His mother called after him in panic, but he kept running until he stood before Grace, breathless and shaking. In his mittened hand was a crushed wildflower, brown at the edges, saved somehow from the last days before frost. "I found it by the creek," he whispered. "I thought you might need something pretty." Grace's heart bent under the weight of that small mercy. She knelt, careful not to let the guard see how much it hurt, and took the flower as if it were made of gold. "Thank you, Noah." His eyes filled. "Are you coming back?" The question moved through the crowd like a blade of cold air. Grace could not lie to him. She brushed a snowflake from his hat and said, "I am going to try to come back as someone no one can send away again." Noah nodded, too young to understand, old enough to grieve. When Grace stood, one of the Blackridge riders opened the carriage door. Inside waited a narrow seat, a wool blanket, and a silence that felt larger than the road ahead. Alpha Warren handed the treaty tube to the lead rider. "Silverbrook honors its obligation." Grace stepped into the carriage before anyone could touch her. The door shut with a final wooden click. As the horses pulled away, she looked through the small rear window. Silverbrook grew smaller behind her, all white roofs and watching faces. No one waved except Noah. Grace lifted the wilted flower to her chest and held it there while the border road curved into the pines. Ahead, Blackridge waited with a lie wrapped in royal wax, and Grace, sold as payment, carried the only thing no treaty could price, the quiet refusal to become what they called her. The carriage crossed the Silverbrook border just after sunrise, and Grace felt the change before she saw the marker stones. The air seemed to thin. The road narrowed from packed snow into a hard ribbon of frozen mud, winding between black pines so tall they turned the morning into a tunnel of blue shadow. Behind her, home had vanished. Ahead, the rival territory opened mile by mile, quiet as a held breath. Grace sat with her canvas bag at her feet, her mother's scarf around her shoulders, and Noah's wilted flower tucked safely inside her locket. Across from her, one Blackridge guard watched the window while another shifted restlessly beside the door. The younger one had removed his hood, revealing sandy hair damp with sweat despite the cold. His face had gone pale. At first, Grace thought it was fear of the road or hatred of the girl they had been sent to collect, but then his hand trembled as he reached for the strap near his seat. He swallowed hard, blinked too slowly, and leaned his head back as if the carriage walls were spinning. "You are sick," Grace said softly. The older guard gave a sharp look. "He is fine." The younger guard tried to straighten. "I am fine." His voice cracked around the lie. Grace knew fever when she saw it. She had seen it in children, hunters, mothers too tired to rest, and her own mother during the winter that took her away. Fever did not care about pride. It only waited for the body to surrender. Grace opened her canvas bag and pulled out a small cloth pouch of dried willow bark and feverfew. The older guard's hand moved toward his belt, not threatening but wary. "What is that?" "Medicine," Grace answered. "Not magic. Not poison. Just herbs." "You expect us to trust Silverbrook hands?" he asked. Grace looked at the young guard, whose breathing had grown uneven. "No. I expect you to care whether he can stay in the saddle once we stop." The words were quiet, but they landed. The older guard looked away first. Grace took that as permission. She leaned forward, careful and slow, and held the herbs out in her open palm. "Chew this. It will taste bitter. Do not swallow all at once. Let it sit under your tongue." The young guard hesitated. Then his shaking fingers closed around the herbs. "My name is Daniel," he murmured, as if giving her that small truth cost him something. "Grace," she said. "I know." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Everyone knows. They said you were the payment." The word should have cut deeper, but Grace was almost used to it now. Payment. Obligation. Girl. Omega. 100 names that were not names at all. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the trees pass. "And what do you say?" Daniel looked ashamed. The carriage wheels creaked over a patch of old ice. Finally, he whispered, "I say you look colder than any payment should." It was not much. It was not rescue. It did not change the locked door or the miles between Grace and any place that would call her safe. But it was the first human sentence she had heard since leaving Silverbrook, and her heart, stubborn thing that it was, held on to it. By noon, they stopped beside a narrow creek to water the horses. The sky had turned a hard winter white. Grace stepped down under watch, her boots sinking 2 inches into snow. Daniel leaned against the carriage, still pale but steadier. When the older guard turned to check the harness, Daniel quietly handed her a tin cup of water. "Miss Miller," he said. The title struck her so unexpectedly that she nearly dropped the cup. Not girl. Not Omega. Not property. Miss Miller. Grace stared at the water trembling in her hands, and for one aching second, she had to turn her face toward the trees so no one would see what kindness could do to someone who had been starved of it. "Thank you," she said. Daniel nodded once, then lowered his voice. "Blackridge is not what they told you. Alpha Marcus tells one story at the border and another behind the gates." Grace's fingers tightened around the cup. "What does that mean?" Before he could answer, the older guard called his name, and Daniel stepped away as if the words had never been spoken. But Grace had heard them. She carried them back into the carriage like a coal hidden beneath ash. As the road climbed toward Blackridge territory, she began to notice things that did not belong. Fresh wagon tracks veered off the treaty road toward the eastern ridge. 3 riders watched from a hilltop, then disappeared the moment the carriage approached. And when Grace glimpsed the treaty tube resting beneath the older guard's coat, the red wax seal did not bear the clean royal mark she had seen on public decrees. It was close but not perfect. One line of the crown was crooked. One wolf's eye was missing. Her stomach tightened, not with fear now but with understanding. This was not only a sale. This was something larger, dressed up as peace. Grace looked down at her hands, the same hands Silverbrook had considered worthless unless they could be traded away. They had soothed fever before. They had held dying flowers and frightened children. Now they curled slowly into fists beneath her mother's scarf. Somewhere ahead, Blackridge waited for her to kneel. But Grace Miller had just seen the first crack in their lie, and once she saw a wound, she had never known how to leave it alone. Blackridge appeared at the top of the mountain road like a fortress built from winter itself. Its outer wall stretched across the ridge in dark stone, with iron lanterns burning pale gold against the snow and tall banners snapping in the wind. Grace saw the black wolf emblem first, its head lifted beneath a silver crown that was not royal, only pretending to be. The missing eye and the wax seal flashed through her mind, and the tightness in her stomach returned. This place was not waiting for peace. It was waiting for a performance. The carriage rolled beneath the gate just as the afternoon light faded into a cold gray dusk. Pack members had gathered along the courtyard, not cheering, not welcoming, only watching with the sharp curiosity of people who had been told a story and were waiting to see whether the story could kneel. Grace stepped down before anyone offered a hand. Snow pressed around her boots. The air smelled of pine smoke, horses, and something metallic from the old chains hanging beside the gate as warnings from a harsher age. She kept her shoulders straight, her mother's scarf tucked close, Noah's flower hidden inside her locket. At the far end of the courtyard, Alpha Marcus Vale stood on the steps of the main hall, dressed in a long charcoal coat with silver clasps. He was younger than Grace had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, handsome in a polished, empty way, with dark hair combed neatly back and a smile that never reached his eyes. Beside him stood 2 elders, a scribe, and a table covered with documents. The treaty tube rested there like a sleeping snake. "Grace Miller of Silverbrook," Marcus called, his voice carrying easily over the courtyard. "You arrive under lawful transfer, witnessed by both packs and sealed by royal authority." Grace looked at the red wax again. Closed but wrong. A false crown. A blind wolf. A lie wearing ceremony clothes. Daniel stood among the riders, his face still pale from fever, his eyes flicking once toward her before he lowered them. That small movement told her enough. He knew. Maybe not all of it, but enough to be afraid. Marcus descended 1 step. "Come forward." Grace walked. Each step felt measured by hundreds of eyes. The courtyard seemed too wide, the stones too cold, the silence too eager. When she reached the table, the scribe unrolled the parchment and dipped his pen. The document was written in elegant black ink, but one word near the center pulled her breath short. Servitude. Not alliance. Not sanctuary. Not bride. Servitude. "This is not the agreement Silverbrook was told," she said. A murmur rippled through the gathered wolves. Marcus tilted his head, amused. Silverbrook was told what desperate packs are always told. Enough. Grace's fingers curled beneath the edge of her scarf. "You said this was to settle a border claim. It will." His smile sharpened. "Once your old pack admits, through your transfer, that Blackridge holds authority over disputed land. After that, they will have no legal ground left to stand on." The courtyard blurred for half a second, not from tears, but from the force of understanding. She had not been sent to prevent a war. She had been used to excuse one. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she and the nearest elders could hear. "Do not look so wounded, little Omega. Your suffering will make the story more believable." Grace looked up at him then. Really looked. She saw no rage in his face, no hunger, no wild cruelty. Only calculation. That made it worse. He was not out of control. He was choosing every inch of this. The scribe pushed the pen toward her. "Place your mark here," acknowledging Blackridge protection and permanent service. Protection. The word almost made her laugh. Grace thought of Silverbrook's children, of Noah asking if she would come back, of Alpha Warren handing over the treaty as if her life were a receipt. She thought of Daniel calling her Miss Miller beside the creek. She thought of her mother's voice, soft as candlelight, telling her that gentle hands still had the right to refuse harm. Grace lifted the pen and for one breath everyone believed she would sign. Then she set it down untouched. No, the word was small, but it moved through the courtyard like a bell. Marcus's face did not change at first. Only his eyes cooled. "You misunderstand your position. I understand it better than you hoped I would." The murmurs grew louder. An elder leaned toward Marcus, whispering urgently, but Marcus raised one hand and the courtyard quieted again. "You belong to Blackridge now." Grace's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat, but her voice stayed clear. A person cannot belong to a pack that had to lie to receive her. For the first time, Marcus stopped smiling. Somewhere beyond the wall, thunder rolled across the mountains, though no storm had been forecast. The sound was low, distant, almost like wheels over frozen stone. Grace did not know that royal riders had already crossed the northern pass. She did not know that Ethan Blackwood, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, had spent 3 days following the trail of a forged seal. She only knew that the lie in front of her had finally shown its face, and that every eye in Blackridge was watching to see whether an Omega sold as payment would dare remain standing. Marcus let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of pressure. Grace could feel the courtyard shifting around her, not in movement but in mood. The pact members who had gathered to witness a quiet transfer were no longer certain what they were seeing. Some looked at the false treaty. Some looked at Marcus. A few looked at Grace as if she had become dangerous simply by refusing to bow her head. Marcus stepped down from the last stair and stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough for his shadow to fall over the snow between them. "You have courage," he said, almost gently. "That is unfortunate. Courage makes simple things messy." Grace kept her hands folded at her waist so no one would see them tremble. "Truth makes false things messy." A faint murmur moved through the crowd before Marcus turned his head, and every voice disappeared. He smiled again, but this time the expression had edges. "You believe a few careful words can save you because Silverbrook let you survive on pity. Blackridge is not Silverbrook. Here order matters." He lifted the parchment from the table and held it high enough for the crowd to see. "This transfer bears Silverbrook's mark. Their Alpha accepted our terms. Their elders witnessed the obligation. Whether this Omega likes the language or not is irrelevant." Grace stared at the seal. Her pulse beat fast, but her thoughts sharpened around one small detail. "Then send for a royal verifier." The words left her before fear could stop them. Marcus stilled. Grace heard Daniel inhale somewhere behind her. She turned slightly toward the crowd, not enough to challenge Marcus but enough to be heard. "If the seal is real, a royal verifier can confirm it. If the treaty is lawful, you lose nothing by proving it." The courtyard changed again. Heads tilted. Eyes narrowed. The scribe lowered his pen. Marcus folded the parchment slowly, too slowly, and set it back on the table. "A sold Omega still thinks she has a voice." Grace felt the insult land, and for a moment she was back in Silverbrook's upstairs hall, hearing herself reduced to a price. The same old lesson pressed against her ribs. Be quiet. Be useful. Be grateful that your suffering serves someone else. But then she remembered Noah's small hand offering a dying flower. Daniel's tin cup of water. Her mother's herbs drying in a window. All the tiny proofs that gentleness could exist, even in places built to crush it. Grace lifted her chin. A voice is the last thing you can take from someone. The words rang clearer than she expected. No shout. No challenge carved from anger. Just truth steady enough to stand on. Marcus's eyes cooled, and the elders beside him shifted uneasily. "Kneel," he said. Grace did not move. "Kneel, and this ends quietly." The snow beneath her boots glittered under the courtyard torches. Grace could hear her own breathing, slow in, slow out, the way her mother had taught her when fear made the world too loud. She looked past Marcus to the Blackridge people watching from the steps and balconies. A young mother held a toddler against her hip. An old man leaned on a cane. A teenage girl in a gray cloak stared at Grace with wide, frightened eyes, as if seeing a possibility she had never been allowed to imagine. Grace understood then that this moment was no longer only hers. If she knelt to a lie, the lie would become law in every fearful heart watching. "No," Grace said again. This time the word did not tremble. Marcus's face hardened, not with fury, but with the cold displeasure of a man whose stage had gone wrong. He reached for the iron stamp on the table, the one meant to mark documents of service, and held it above the parchment instead of her. "Then I will record your refusal as rebellion against lawful transfer." The scribe hesitated. Marcus's voice dropped. "Write it." The scribe dipped his pen, but his hand shook. Before ink touched paper, Daniel stepped forward from the line of writers. "Alpha Marcus." The courtyard turned toward him. His face was pale, his fever not fully gone, but he stood straight. "The seal should be verified." Marcus looked at him as if he had forgotten Daniel existed. Return to your place. Daniel swallowed. She treated me on the road when she did not have to. She asked for nothing. If she says the seal is wrong, then perhaps we should look. Grace's heart caught. It was a small defense. A dangerous one. And it was enough to crack the silence open. Another rider glanced at the treaty. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Royal verifier." Marcus raised one hand, and the whisper died, but not completely. It lingered like smoke. Then, beyond the outer gate, came the sound Grace had mistaken for distant thunder. Hoofs, many of them, measured, heavy, approaching fast over frozen stone. The gate guards turned. The banners snapped hard in the wind. Marcus's smile vanished. Grace looked toward the archway just as a black horse emerged beneath the iron lanterns, followed by riders in dark royal cloaks marked with the true silver crown. At their center rode a man with midnight hair, winter-gray eyes, and a stillness that made the entire courtyard seem to hold its breath. No one announced him. No one needed to. Every wolf there knew the Alpha King had arrived. The courtyard lowered itself around Ethan Blackwood before he spoke a single word. Heads bowed first, then shoulders, then knees touching the snow one by one until the entire gathering seemed pulled down by the weight of his presence. Grace remained standing because no one had told her what to do, and because some quiet, stubborn part of her refused to kneel before another man who might decide her fate without asking. The Alpha King dismounted with controlled ease, his black coat moving in the wind like a shadow given form. He was not the monster from old pack stories. He was worse in a way Grace did not expect. He was calm. No wasted motion. No raised voice. No need to prove power because every breath in the courtyard had already adjusted around him. His winter-gray eyes moved over Marcus, the elders, the scribe, Daniel, the false treaty on the table, and finally Grace. For one impossible second the cold seemed to leave the air. Ethan looked at her not as property, not as payment, not as an inconvenience interrupting a border claim, but as a person standing alone in the center of something designed to make her disappear. Marcus recovered first. He descended the remaining steps and bowed with practiced grace. "Your Majesty, Blackridge is honored by your presence. Had we known you were coming, we would have prepared a proper welcome." Ethan's gaze did not move from the table. "You prepared enough." The words were quiet, but Marcus's smile tightened. A royal captain stepped forward and placed a leather case beside the treaty. Inside were seal plates, silver measuring cords, and a small glass lens used by royal verifiers. Grace had only seen such tools once before, when a traveling magistrate settled a land dispute near Silverbrook. Her heart began to pound again, not with fear this time, but with the sharp ache of hope trying to rise too soon. Ethan held out one gloved hand. The document. No one moved. Then the scribe, pale and shaking, lifted the parchment and gave it to him. Ethan unfolded it slowly. The courtyard waited. The wind pulled at torches. Snow settled on Grace's hair and melted against her skin. Ethan read the first line, then the second, then the paragraph where Grace's name appeared beneath the word service. His jaw did not clench. His voice did not change. Somehow that made the silence more dangerous. "This is not a treaty," he said. Marcus spread his hands. "With respect, Your Majesty, Silverbrook's Alpha agreed to the terms. Their mark is present. Their debt is documented. The girl was transferred willingly by pack authority." Ethan looked up at him. "This is a crime." The courtyard went so still Grace could hear the soft gasp of the young mother on the steps. Marcus's face lost color, then composure. "There must be some misunderstanding." "There is." Ethan set the parchment down and touched the red wax with 2 fingers. "You misunderstood my crown as decoration." The royal captain bent over the seal with the glass lens. "False impression, Your Majesty. Crown line broken. Wolf eye missing. Wax mix contains black resin, not royal silver pine." Whispers spread like sparks. Grace watched Marcus's confidence crack by one careful inch. Ethan turned toward the gathered pack. "No Omega, no child. No citizen of any territory under my rule can be sold to settle a debt. Not by an Alpha. Not by elders. Not by desperate men who hide greed behind winter." The words reached something deep in Grace, something tired and bruised and still listening for her mother's voice. She had imagined rescue as noise, as rage, as a door breaking open. She had not imagined it could sound like law spoken clearly in the snow. Marcus stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Your Majesty, this girl is from Silverbrook, a rival pack. She has every reason to lie." Ethan looked at Grace then, and the full force of his attention made her breath catch. "Did you agree to this transfer?" The question was simple. That was what made it devastating. No one in Silverbrook had asked. No one in Blackridge had cared. Grace felt every eye turn back to her. Her knees wanted to weaken, but Daniel stood a few yards away, still pale, still brave enough to have spoken once. Noah's flower rested against her heart. Her mother's scarf held warmth at her throat. Grace lifted her chin. "I agreed to leave so children would not suffer for decisions they did not make," she said. "I did not agree to become someone's property. I did not agree to help a lie become law." Ethan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Grace saw it. Not pity, recognition. As if he had been searching for the truth in ink and wax, only to find it standing in front of him with snow in her hair and fear in her hands. Marcus opened his mouth, but Ethan raised one hand. The rival alpha fell silent. "Then your testimony stands," Ethan said. He removed his royal cloak, dark and lined with silver, and placed it around Grace's shoulders before the entire courtyard. The weight of it was warm, heavy, and impossible to misunderstand. Not ownership. Protection. A boundary drawn in velvet and authority. Then Ethan turned back to Marcus, his voice colder than the mountain wind. "By royal decree, this transfer is void. Blackridge is under investigation. Silverbrook will answer for its part. And until the court convenes, Grace Miller stands under my protection." For the first time since the war bell rang, Grace could breathe. But as her fingers closed around the edge of the royal cloak, a faint silver warmth stirred beneath the skin of her wrist, hidden for now beneath her sleeve, waiting for the moment destiny would no longer stay silent. The royal cloak settled around Grace like warmth from a world she had never been allowed to enter. It smelled faintly of cedar, snow, and clean smoke, but beneath it, her own heartbeat was still wild. Protection did not feel like safety yet. It felt like standing on a bridge between two cliffs, knowing one wrong step could still send everything below into darkness. Ethan Blackwood turned to his captain. "Secure the documents. Question the scribe separately. No one leaves Blackridge until every seal is verified." The captain bowed. "Yes, Your Majesty." Marcus's composure returned in fragments, enough to make his voice smooth again. "This is an overreach. Blackridge has honored the crown for generations. One questionable seal does not justify humiliating an entire pack in its own courtyard." Ethan looked at him with the patience of a winter storm waiting beyond the mountains. "You humiliated your pack when you asked them to witness a lie." A ripple passed through the gathered wolves. Marcus's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Grace stepped forward. The movement surprised even her. The cloak slipped slightly from one shoulder, and she caught it with trembling fingers. "There is more." Every face turned. Ethan's gaze softened by the smallest measure, not enough for others to notice, but enough for Grace to feel that he was not commanding her to continue. He was giving her room to choose. "Speak only if you wish to," he said. That almost broke her. Not the cold. Not Silverbrook's silence. Not Marcus's public scorn. That simple permission. Grace swallowed the ache in her throat and looked at the royal captain, then at the Blackridge people crowded on the steps and balconies. "On the road here I saw fresh wagon tracks leading away from the treaty route toward the eastern ridge. 3 riders watched the carriage from above, then vanished when we approached. Daniel heard enough to know something was wrong, and the seal on the treaty tube did not match the crown seal I have seen on royal decrees." Daniel stepped forward at the sound of his name, pale but steady. "It is true, Your Majesty. I should have reported it sooner." Marcus turned on him. "You forget your rank." Daniel lowered his eyes but not his voice. "No, Alpha. I remembered my conscience." The courtyard drew in a breath. Grace felt something shift then, not in the snow or sky but in people. The young mother on the steps held her child tighter. The old man with the cane nodded once, barely visible. The teenage girl in the gray cloak stared at Daniel as if courage could be contagious. Ethan's captain sent 2 riders toward the eastern gate without needing a spoken order. Marcus watched them go, and for the first time, fear crossed his face quickly enough that Grace almost missed it. Ethan did not. What is on the eastern ridge? Marcus gave a small laugh. Storage barns. Hunting sheds. Nothing that concerns the crown. Everything that touches a forged royal seal concerns the crown. Ethan's voice remained calm, but the words left no path around them. Grace looked down, suddenly aware of the silver warmth beneath her sleeve again. It pulsed once, gentle as moonlight touching water. She pressed her wrist against the cloak to hide it. This was not the time for mystery. This was the time for truth. Marcus saw the movement and seized on it. "Look at her," he said to the crowd. A Silverbrook Omega wrapped in royal cloth for less than 10 minutes, already performing innocence like a trained saint. She came from the pack that defaulted on its debt. She benefits from every accusation she makes. Grace felt the old shame rise, familiar and cold. For years, people had made her goodness sound like weakness and her silence sound like guilt. She could feel the courtyard wavering, not fully against her but uncertain. Uncertainty was where men like Marcus built their homes. Ethan took 1 step toward her. Grace Miller. Her name in his voice did not sound like a burden. It sounded like a fact the world had failed to honor. What do you want recorded before the royal court? The question stunned her. Not what did Marcus do? Not what did Silverbrook owe? Not what punishment should fall? What do you want? Grace looked across the courtyard and saw every version of herself she had been forced to bury. The child who wanted her mother back, the girl who wanted to be chosen, the Omega who wanted one person to say she mattered before she became useful. Her voice came out quiet, but it carried. I want my name removed from every debt I never made. The words moved through Blackridge like thaw through frozen ground. Ethan inclined his head once solemnly, as if she had given testimony worthy of kings. Then it shall be written. The royal scribe who had arrived with Ethan's company opened a fresh ledger and began to write. Grace watched the ink form her name, not beneath livestock, not beneath servitude, not beneath payment but beneath witness. Her vision blurred for a second and she blinked hard. She would not cry in Marcus's courtyard. Not yet. Then a horn sounded from the eastern ridge. One long note. The royal riders had found something. Marcus went still. Ethan turned toward the sound, and every wolf in Blackridge felt the moment sharpen. Grace's wrist warmed again beneath the cloak, brighter this time, as if the moon itself was listening. The horn from the eastern ridge faded into the mountains, but its warning stayed behind, hanging over the courtyard like a second sky. No one moved until Ethan lifted one hand, and even then the order was quiet. Bring what they found. Marcus stood too still. Grace had learned to recognize stillness in powerful men. Sometimes it was control. Sometimes it was fear wearing a better coat. The royal riders returned through the eastern gate minutes later with ledgers sealed in black ribbon, storage manifests, and 3 crates marked as winter grain. When the captain opened the first crate, there was grain on top, only a thin layer, golden enough to fool a passing glance. Beneath it lay folded maps, forged notices and blank treaty paper stamped with the same crooked crown. A sound moved through Blackridge, not loud but deep. Shock. Shame. Understanding. The people on the steps looked at Marcus as if they were seeing him for the first time without candlelight arranged in his favor. Ethan's captain read from one of the ledgers, his voice clear in the cold. Planned seizure routes. Silverbrook, Ash Hollow, Pineford. False royal authority prepared in advance. Border claims marked for escalation after transfer acceptance. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Silverbrook had not been saved by her sacrifice. It had been chosen as the first match to light a larger fire. Her leaving had not ended danger. It had revealed it. Ethan turned to Marcus. You intended to use her name as the first stone in a war road. Marcus's expression flickered, then hardened. I intended to secure Blackridge before weaker packs dragged us into ruin. You sit on a throne and call it peace. We stand at the borders and pay for your patience. You forged my seal. Because your court moves slowly while our enemies multiply. Ethan's voice remained low. And so you made enemies from hungry neighbors and called it strategy. The word struck harder than shouting would have. Marcus looked toward his own pack, perhaps expecting loyalty, but found faces turned away from him. The young mother stepped back. The old man with the cane removed his Blackridge pin and held it in his palm as if it had become too heavy to wear. Daniel bowed his head, grief and relief crossing his face together. Grace felt the silver warmth at her wrist brighten again. This time she could not ignore it. A thin crescent of light slipped from beneath her sleeve, soft and unmistakable, touching the edge of Ethan's cloak. She covered it quickly, but Ethan saw. His eyes dropped to her wrist, then returned to her face, and something ancient passed through his expression before he mastered it. Not possession. Not triumph. Wonder restrained by respect. Marcus saw it too, and desperation sharpened his voice. There. You see? She is not innocent. Some hidden mark, some Silverbrook trick. She has bewitched this court since the moment she arrived. Grace's stomach twisted, but Ethan stepped between her and the accusation without touching her. Enough. The single word silenced the courtyard. Ethan turned not to Marcus but to the gathered pack. Hear the court's temporary ruling. Marcus Vale is suspended from authority pending formal judgment. The forged documents are seized. Blackridge will remain under royal supervision until its elders are reviewed. Silverbrook will be summoned to answer for the transfer of Grace Miller and for signing away a citizen under debt pressure. The royal scribe wrote swiftly. Snow dusted the page and melted into the ink. Ethan continued, every agreement naming Grace Miller as payment, service, property, or obligation is void as of this moment. Grace's breath caught so sharply it almost hurt. Void. One word, and the chain she had never agreed to wear fell somewhere no one could see. Ethan turned to her then, and the courtyard seemed to disappear at the edges. Grace Miller, he said, formal enough for the law, gentle enough for her heart to hear the difference. You are free to return to Silverbrook, remain under royal protection, or choose another place of safety until the court convenes. No pack will claim you. No alpha will speak for you. What do you choose? It was too much. Not the question itself but the space inside it. Choice felt enormous after years of being folded small enough to fit other people's needs. Grace looked toward the road that led back to Silverbrook and felt no pull except sorrow. She looked at Blackridge and saw people waking from a lie. Then she looked at the royal cloak around her shoulders and at the man who had given it without asking for anything in return. I will go with the court, she said. Not as a possession. As a witness. Ethan bowed his head. As a witness. The crescent on her wrist glowed brighter, slipping free in full silver light. Gasps rose around them. A faded mark. A royal one. Ethan saw it, and for the first time the Alpha King looked almost afraid, not of destiny but of mishandling it. He lowered himself to one knee in the snow before her, not claiming, not commanding, only honoring what had appeared between them. Then let destiny wait, he said, until you are ready. Grace stood wrapped in royal silver, free for the first time, while the entire courtyard bowed not to what she had been sold as, but to what she had chosen to become. The royal court convened 3 weeks later under the glass dome of Nordhaven, where winter sunlight poured across white stone floors and made every lie look smaller than it had in the dark. Grace Miller stood before 12 magistrates with Ethan Blackwood seated above them, not beside her, not speaking for her, but listening as she told the story in her own voice. She spoke of the war bell before dawn, the council room door, the false seal, the road through the pines, Daniel's fever, Marcus Vale's courtyard, and the word servitude written where her life should never have been placed. Silverbrook's elders shifted uneasily as every sentence found them. Alpha Warren did not meet her eyes. Madison sat behind him in a pale dress with her hands folded too tightly in her lap, no smirk left on her face. When the magistrate asked Grace what she had lost, the room expected tears or anger, or a demand for revenge. Grace looked down at the silver crescent on her wrist, now calm beneath the cuff of her sleeve, and answered, I lost the belief that being useful would make people love me. I would like that belief returned to no one. The judgment came before sunset. Marcus Vale was removed from power and sent to a remote estate under royal guard while Blackridge elected interim elders beneath court supervision. Silverbrook was ordered to repay its debts through land arbitration and shared harvest labor, never through a person's body, name, or freedom. Alpha Warren was stripped of authority for 1 year and required to stand before his own pack, and read the new decree aloud. Most important of all, The court abolished every debt transfer clause that allowed an Omega, child, widow, or dependent citizen to be traded between packs. The law was written in black ink and sealed with the true royal crown, but Grace knew laws were more than ink only when someone was brave enough to speak them into life. 2 days later, she returned to Silverbrook, not in a prisoner's carriage, but on horseback beside the royal company, wrapped in her own blue wool cloak. The village gathered in the square, silent with the kind of shame that did not know where to put its hands. Noah was there near the bakery steps, taller than she remembered though only 3 weeks had passed, his red scarf bright against the snow. Grace smiled at him first. He smiled back as if Dawn had chosen one window in particular. Alpha Warren read the decree with a voice that cracked at the words "No citizen shall be named as payment." Then he turned to Grace and said in front of everyone, "Silverbrook failed you." The apology did not heal everything. Grace had learned that healing was not pretending a wound had never existed. Healing was cleaning it, naming it, and refusing to let it poison the whole body. She accepted the apology without offering him comfort he had not earned. Madison approached last, pale and quiet. "I was cruel because it was easier than being afraid," she whispered. Grace studied her stepsister's face and saw, not friendship, not yet, but the first honest crack in pride. "Then learn to be afraid without becoming cruel," Grace said. By spring, Grace lived in Northaven as an apprentice royal healer, working with herbs in sunlit rooms that smelled of lavender, cedar, and warm bread from the kitchens below. Daniel recovered fully and became a court witness officer, known for checking every seal twice. Blackridge rebuilt under leaders chosen by its own people. Silverbrook sent its first fair harvest tithe in 10 years. And Ethan Blackwood waited. He did not court her with pressure or public claims. He sent books on healing law, walked with her in the palace gardens at a respectful distance, and asked questions no one had ever asked her before. "What do you think? What do you want? What would make you feel safe?" On the night of the new moon, Grace found him beneath the white oak at the edge of the palace grounds, where lanterns glowed like captured stars. The silver crescent on her wrist warmed before he even turned. Ethan bowed his head. "You do not owe destiny an answer tonight." Grace stepped closer, not because a bond pulled her, but because her own heart had learned the shape of trust. "I know," she said. "That is why my answer can be mine." She placed her hand in his. The crescent light rose softly between them, not a chain, not a command, but a promise freely chosen. Far beyond the palace, packs across the northern territories would tell the story differently. Some would say the Alpha King saved the souled Omega. Some would say destiny crowned a forgotten girl. But Grace knew the truth. She had not become queen because she was rescued. She became queen because when the world priced her as a debt, she stood up and named herself free.